Okay, yeah, so we're introducing ourselves today. My name is Pen-Yuan Hsing. It's a complicated name, so everyone just calls me Pen. I kind of have a checkered past. I used to spend my past life out among wildlife, studying them. That's what I used to do. Later on, during my PhD, I started a citizen science project where I worked with a lot of local communities to monitor their own wildlife. But it was actually during that time, I got really involved in a lot of open research communities in all of its different facets, right? For example, I edited a book on how to write reproducible code. I've worked on developing some open research courses for researchers to take. I'm working on one right now, and also did some work on some policy documents on how to encourage people like us to do more open research. And that's what eventually led me here to work with Jackie and Marcus on Octopus, which I will briefly talk about today, but also some other stuff as well. And that's what I'm going to be working on for the rest of this year. And we're very lucky to also have Mariia, who's been very helpful in this process, and I will let her say something about herself.
Thank you. So my name is Mariia. I don't have like a huge background for the moment, but I've been studying in Ukraine. I've been studying journalism and publishing and editing studies, and then I moved to Czech Republic, and where I was studying sociology and social policy. Then I came to Bristol, studying sociology, and here I am working with Pen and Jackie on Octopus project. This is my first professional sort of work, I would say, after graduating. So I'm just very happy to be here.
Cool, thank you. All right, so today, like I said, I will be talking about Octopus a little bit. So that's going to be, I guess you can say, the beginning of the talk, because after coming here several months ago, people keep asking me, what is Octopus? Yes.
You can move that part.
Yeah, how do you do that? Oh, right. Here we go. Yeah. Okay. What is Octopus? But the meat of our presentation today is this evaluation we've been doing since September on research culture in different disciplines, because we want to see how this new Octopus platform can fit into the world that we have to survive in right now. And just also a little bit on what we're planning to do next on this evaluation. Okay, so just very quickly, this is actually the logo of Octopus, the new platform that people have been developing with a lot of high-level support from people like JISC and UKRI and big funders like that. If you go to their website, this is what it looks like, and it's a place for you to publish the components of your research, right? Rather than having to wrap everything up into one big paper at the end, you can publish your work as you do it. So they actually split the types of things you can publish on Octopus into 8 different types, starting with your original research problem. So this is kind of like a high-level discussion of the question that you want to answer. Then you can follow up that with specific hypotheses that you have based on that research problem, followed by methods to test that hypothesis. You can publish your results, how you've analyzed it, how you've interpreted those results. And then, this one's interesting to me, any other real-world applications that you can make based on the work that you've done. Now, another interesting thing to me was that they really make a point of driving at home that by publishing individual components like this, oh, sorry, by the way, the 8th type is the peer review that you can publish after publication, and the review can be on any of the other 7 types of publication types in Octopus, right? But what I was saying is that for any of these 8 types of publications, the cool thing is that people can get more granular credit for the work that they do as part of a research project, right? For example, if Angelica is responsible for doing a lot of the analysis, then her name would be, the first author on that publication. So it really brings a different kind of visibility and recognition to the work that people do. Another really interesting thing is that we might sometimes think of this process as a very linear one, where you go from one end to the other. But what Octopus allows you to do is that rather than linking them in this fashion, it can also branch out. Maybe someone else comes in, looks at the hypothesis that you've published, but they come up with a different set of methods to test that, and they might collect different data. And this kind of branching is also something that Octopus would like to encourage, because doing science is very much about remixing what's out there and building new things with it. And I really like this idea. So this is just a super quick introduction to some of the capabilities of Octopus. But I'm going to leave it at that for now, because again, I want to jump into the main work that we've been doing over the past few months, which is evaluating the actual world of research that Octopus is going into. And to do this work, we did three things. So Mariia conducted a very extensive literature review of existing studies people have done on the meta level of how people do research. I did work on a practitioner survey that was sent out to a lot of people within and outside of the UK. And I interviewed a bunch of researchers over the past few months as well. So starting with the literature review, I'm going to hand it to the expert who actually did all of this work. Okay. Do you want to hold this?
I can, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So, should I mention like all research questions, aims?
Sure.
Yeah, good. So with for the literature review, we've screened more than like almost 400 articles, and after processing them and reading some of them, we considered that 260 articles were like relevant for us for our literature review. And we have split all our findings into 5 categories according to 5 main aims of Octopus. I'll stop a bit on methodology of the literature review. So, so we used systematic search using the Web of Science, and we were using combinations of words associated with our main research topics. And then after extracting some interesting findings, we used a snowballing search strategy to find some additional relevant literature. For instance, we screened reference lists of articles that we considered relevant. All findings were related to many disciplines, so we were looking to we wanted to cover all disciplines, all topics, and we tried to be as much diverse as we could. And also we included different types of studies like quantitative, qualitative, reviews, opinion papers, everything that could give us a good understanding of what the research culture looked like, how it looks like. Then all articles were added to Zotero library, and we were also discussing some problematic articles which were not clear, or if they were if we had some doubts, we discussed it together. And then we extracted our findings to Google spreadsheet, where we when we included information about author, a name, year of publication, is because we wanted to have more the newest, the latest findings, types of evidence, subject area, and area of focus of those articles. So the first research question was, what are the barriers and hierarchies that restrict research sharing and impede more meritocratic recognition, especially for early career researchers and specialists. And all findings on this topic we've split on 3 categories, which you can see here: environment and external factors, inequalities between countries with different income levels, and ideological barriers to sharing. And I'm gonna briefly describe all factors which were in every category. So environment and external factors included time pressure, lack of guidance, limited support and funding, competitive environment, and lack of professional reward. And the last one was related to journals policies. So some studies found that lack of time frustrated data sharing initiatives, that scientists felt that they couldn't find work and life balance, that they were not willing to share or publish their data. And other studies reported that especially early career researchers did not have enough guidance, did not have enough trainings for their for open sharing. And another problem was unequal access to fundings, and for individual researchers it was a big problem because they couldn't afford paying publication fees. Another barrier was competitive environment. As I said, that some researchers shared that they were not willing to share data because they were afraid that other scientists would exploit those data or like share them in some kind of inappropriate way. Other studies found that scientists felt lack of advantage or professional reward, and they considered that publishing in or open access journals may be less prestigious as publishing in subscription-based journals. And another barriers that restricted sharing data was related to journals policies. And academics shared that some open access publishers may still apply restrictive policies, which prevent them from sharing their research. Another section of barriers was related to inequalities between countries with different income levels. And many studies highlighted that researchers from low and middle income countries do not have equal access to resources. They do not have an appropriate knowledge of English language. They struggling to publish in English, and they even have like limited access to internet. So, they don't have access to international publications or data. So this was the main barrier for researchers from low middle income countries. And the third section was related to ideology about open access. And some scientists were thinking that open access journals are something similar to predatory journals, that they may steal their data. Predatory journals are known by tricking authors or creating some websites and pretending to be legitimate publishers. So researchers were scared that that predatory journals would misuse their data in some way. The second research question was related to questionable research practices. Which pressures lead to questionable research practices? And here we had 5 main factors, main pressures. First one is publish or perish culture, which it pressures scientists to favor quantity over quality. And in this rush to publish as much as they can, the quality of publications decrease, unfortunately. Another pressure was pressure to get novel findings. Still, unfortunately, according to some studies, research culture is oriented towards novel findings, and this creates again kind of racing where everyone is trying to find something new and to publish it as soon as possible. And unfortunately, reproducibility in this case is valued less than novelty. And those who have clean data or significant results win this race for recognition and get published. Another factor was dependence on fundings, and this may look great that some kind of fields receive grants and fundings and everything, but this creates lack of time for gathering data actually, and to thinking about those data. Again, it goes to the same racing for publishing and getting the positive results. Next factor or next pressure is hierarchical pressure from superiors or competitive environment. And surveys showed that competitive environment makes scientists focus on speed and statistical significance of their research because they just want to build their CV or get published or get reputation. And again, this unfortunately affects integrity, research integrity, and quality of findings. And the last pressure, but not least, is lack of clear policies, that some open access journals still have some gaps in policies, which may allow to avoid some regulations and use questionable research practices without consequences. The third research question was, what are the factors which lead to certain topics and types of research being favored? And here we have 3 types of findings. So first one is that some types of findings may be more favored and encourage researchers make changes in statistics, for example, p-hacking, data dredging, selective reporting, and present statistically significant or positive results in order to get their work published. Second factor is research in certain journals. So sometimes this happens that platform of publishing maybe more that better known platforms are likely to be more cited, publishing in those platforms. So scientists just prefer to publish in well-known platforms or journals. Another factor is field of study, that some fields have more publications in giant journals. Like, for example, social sciences, let's say top 5 publishers, giant publishers, have 70% of papers related to social sciences. The next research question was related to biases. So what biases affect the assessment of publications and their quality? And here we have 3 types of biases. I will not maybe stay here for long because they seem quite obvious. So demographic biases, gender biases. We live in 21st century and female researchers still underrepresented in some disciplines, and some studies showed that last author's female gender was predictive of a lower likelihood of publication, which is not fair. Next one is geographical and language bias, which is kind of same what I said about barriers that scientists from low, middle income countries or non-English speaking countries are struggling to get published. And the third one is bias for author and institutional prestige. Just some assessors may still favor articles from famous authors or from authors that are based in more prestige institutions. And the fifth research question was related to division of labor. And here we have two sections. And unfortunately, there was no many articles that actually describe how the research environment looks like or how division of labor looks like. And they were just discussing how it should look like. And many sources highlighted that collaboration is important, positive critique is important, and those factors are crucial for increasing research productivity. And the second section was discussing kind of importance of roles, different kinds of roles of scientists. And some studies described researchers' roles as generalists, specialists, and versatiles. So generalists are team players, specialists, individual players, and versatiles who do both. And an interesting, just to me, an interesting fact about this is that versatile researchers are more likely to be senior authors. So maybe it says something that when academic reaches some kind of level, they could work both in team and individually, and they could manage other people and be senior authors or supervisors. So two first research questions about QRPs and barriers. We had a lot of articles, a lot of literature on these topics, but unfortunately, the section about division of labor and section about type of findings were not as representative, I would say. So we had less amount of articles on these topics, but still we can understand research culture nowadays better. Yeah, I give it a word to Frank.
Okay, cool. Thanks for telling us about your literature review. So based on that, we tried to design the survey and the interviews around some of the things we learned from the literature review, but also things that we didn't learn so much about, such as on how people divide up their labor right now, right? Which as Mariia was saying, the existing literature doesn't say that much about. So our time is pretty limited. So rather than giving me a comprehensive view of what all of our results are, I think I'm just going to highlight some of the things that really stood out to me as I was looking at the survey results and the interview results and all of that. So some of you might remember this from the Slack channel once when I was asking you for help regarding the link to the survey. Well, eventually it worked. And it's made out of 6 sets of questions on different parts of research culture and how people share their stuff, right? One set was just on their general awareness of different ways and places to publish open research. And for that, I was kind of reassured by most people seem to be unaware of it, which is what I was aiming for, because I want to understand what normal researchers think rather than people who are in the open research bubble like me. Okay, so we had the survey, and I will go through the questions, but it was disseminated first of all here. We announced it in the university, in one of those weekly updates. Again, some of you might have seen that. We also reached out to the UK Reproducibility Network, but this is to get outside of the bubble, so to speak, because they have these institutional leads, right? That can then forward the survey to their entire institutions. So that's what happened. The people actually in the network, like, those are very few people and not all of them fill out the survey. I also tracked down the authors on the last 6 months worth of journal publications tracked in the Web of Science, social science and science citation indexes. So I reached out to almost like 4,000 authors from that list to see if they want to respond to the survey. Okay, so this is where the survey went to, and we got 406 responses from people within the several weeks that we had the survey open. Now, despite my best efforts, 80% of them still came from people in Europe, and yes, that includes people in this country. Only 8% came from people in North America, and about 10% from everywhere else. My personal suspicion is that part of those 10% are people on that list of Web of Science authors that I reached out to. So this, is very European skewed. They're asked to indicate which one out of 25 research fields that they most identify with. They are all represented to an extent in the 406 responses. However, over a third of those responses came from people who identify as coming from very life sciencey and psychology fields, right? So this is something that's important to keep in mind. Half of them have been in their fields for more than 10 years, which I thought was interesting because, like, in my personal experience, a tenured professor probably won't have time to bother with a survey like this. So I was pleasantly surprised. There was also a quarter each from people who have been in their field for less than 10 years and somewhere between 5 and 10 years, right? Okay, so the first set of questions we asked was, at what levels do you feel the following aspects are present in your research? And they were presented with a list of different, facets of research culture. And again, I don't have time to go through everything, but the highlights are that, and this is interesting to me, 84% of those 604 people said they have, fairly high professional satisfaction from the work that they're doing. I think this is really interesting in contrast, or maybe not in contrast, but accompanied by the fact that over half of them think they have low or very low career prospects, which, to be honest, I am completely unsurprised by. But it's interesting how both of these are present at the same time. And by the way, for career prospects, it's the only category where more than half of respondents selected low or very low. So that also stands out to me. Okay, the second thing was, for something that they haven't published for work that they've done but didn't share, like, what are some of the factors that prevented you from sharing and publishing it, right? So about 2/3 of them said that they just don't have time to publish those things. But this is interesting because not having time implies that your time is limited and you have to prioritize other things, right? Instead of publishing, all of the research that you do. So I am mindful of that. And 1/3 of them said that, their findings simply didn't make up for a good story, which I will come back to because we try to expand on the reasons behind this into interviews that we did. Okay, the third set of questions was about, which factors will prevent you from publishing your work. And this was geared towards early stages, when you have a research question or a plan, but you haven't done anything yet. And that the idea is, do you want to share something early on? And almost half of the respondents say that the reason they don't do it is because they're really afraid of being scooped. And this came up a lot in the interviews as well. Just over 1/3 said they don't know where to share this kind of stuff. So this is interesting. And 1/3 of them said that there's just no career benefit to doing so. The fourth set of questions was a little bit more complicated. It's about division of labor, how people take on different tasks in research. And what happens is that we presented them with a list of about 10 different tasks you might do along the research lifecycle. And it largely corresponds to the 8 publication types on Octopus, right? And people were asked to say either they mostly do this task on their own versus, this is mostly a team-based activity with, someone other than me would do. And if you look at the two sides that kind of form here, what I'm seeing is that some of the more practical steps like data collection or analyzing results, cleaning data, it falls more on the, I do it on my own part. But for some of the higher level tasks like defining the research question from the hypothesis and so on, it seems to be more of a team-based kind of activity. However, I think there are two limitations here that I think is a big limitation of this question, to be honest. Number one is that the way we framed the question was asking the researcher to think of a typical project that they work on the problem here. It's that if you think of a typical project like that, you are probably maybe unconsciously amalgamating all of your experiences in doing research. So presumably at some point or another, you've done all of these tasks, right? So I think things are confounded a little bit here. And I think this is one of the weaker questions, to be honest, but I still think it's interesting. You can see a little bit of a grouping here. The next set of questions was on, what is it like for research assessment, whether it's for career advancement like tenure or grant applications and all of that, right? So again, people were able to choose from a lot of factors and so that the strength of influence those factors have on assessment. And the biggest one was their publication record, right? And this is way higher at 61% than any of the other factors that people choose that has a strong influence on the outcome of assessments. Roughly half of them also said that the novelty and trendiness of your work really affect the outcomes of assessments. And I think it's very notable that the rigor of their methodology comes forth after all of these other really big factors. I think that really stands out to me. Okay, so these are 5 of kind of like the main things we looked at to the survey and the responses we got from these 406 people. And I think, the results of the interviews that I did over several months really kind of elucidate a lot of what's going on behind these survey responses. So I want to thank several of you for being very helpful during this process, including testing the interview with me and spending so much time with me to develop that. So thank you very much for that. And we designed the interviews so that they're semi-structured interviews through these 60-minute online calls with researchers from all over the world. And I made sure that we were interviewing non-open sciencey people, right, who are, again, normal researchers, so to speak. So we started by going through our existing networks, but kind of using again the snowballing kind of methodology again, and the transcripts were tagged with different themes that correspond to some of the topics that we care about, which are again division of labor in research, how credit is given, how people do their sharing, how critique is given and received, and also how assessment is done. So I was able to reach out to 14 researchers in the end across several different disciplines, early to late career. We have pretty senior professors who came to the interviews, thankfully, but it was also important to me to get some junior people as well. There was one person who had an undergraduate degree, but did plenty of research that was published. Both academics and non-academics, such as people in NGOs or industry, natural and social sciences, were involved. I was hoping to get some people from the arts and humanities too, but we didn't have time to do that. Again, mostly in Europe, but I really tried hard to reach out to people from other parts of the world, including people I interviewed from Africa or places in East Asia as well. So that was pretty cool. Even though this was not explicitly designed into the methodology, it was important to me that at least half of the interviewees were women. That was true, despite this very limited metric. I think, going forward, I'd like to improve on the diversity even more than this. So what did we learn from all of these interviews? Well, again, this is part of a 50-page report that we're writing right now. So rather than going through all of that again, I'll try to highlight some of the things that really stood out to me. The first one, of course, is that for these people, traditional peer-reviewed papers in journals are the primary way of sharing research. this isn't too surprising to me, but all of them were very consistent in that if given the opportunity, they would very much like to share more of their work rather than just writing papers. And they were super consistent, almost down to the exact wording, that the reason they would like to share more is that they can receive feedback on their research as early as possible, so that they wouldn't have to have done all the work, published it in a paper, and finally find out from a peer reviewer that they've done something terribly wrong, right? So there is a desire here for people to start sharing research early and often, I think. And one of them said that they think this is important because the process of doing research is more important than its output, because the process is something that I can control. I can develop a really good methodology and do it well, right? But I have less control over the output, and I feel like I should be judged more on how I did my research than what came out of it. However, of course, most people don't share different stages of research, right? I think this quote is really insightful. If you are a successful person, then you don't have time to do any of that. And so the barriers are more personal or technical personal, such as some people say. They just feel kind of embarrassed if they share something early on that might be immature, right? Or technical barriers could be, again, like they don't know where or how to publish these results, but also it could be, that they can't afford to publish in an open access journal, for instance. And it can also be other things like language and some of the other things that Mariia mentioned. Now, what's interesting for the technical barriers is that another thing that came out in the interviews was that let's see, I talked about language, cost, and there was training. That was another reason for people not knowing how to share open research, and so on. So there are technical barriers like that. Now, in the conversation I had with interviewees, obviously being in a department like this, when you share your data, you might be concerned about sharing personal information about the people that you study, right, in like clinical trials or something. But in that conversation, what really stood out to me was that, like, you really need to think more broadly, when you think about these issues about how things work in different fields. For instance, if you are a physical scientist, like an astronomer or something, you might be part of a team that builds a space probe that goes to another planet to collect data. And for them, the sensitive data could be, the communications protocols that you use to send commands to the spacecraft, right? Because maybe you don't want other people to get a hold of that communications protocol, so they might redirect that spacecraft back to Earth and crash into a place, or something like that, right? So the way we conceptualize what counts as sensitive data or any other thing in research could be very different depending on which field you're in. But most of the barriers to doing open research and sharing are political. And what I mean by political are things such as scooping that people keep bringing up. They're really afraid of being scooped. How do you define that? Well, most of them didn't explicitly define what scooping means, but it's usually two things: either just outright plagiarism, or even if you have shared something, people might beat you to being first and get a grant on the idea before you are successful in getting it, right? So it's largely these two forms of scooping. And another concern is that I don't want to share what I have because papers are so important. So I want to put everything into my paper because they can make or break careers. And that's because assessments revolve around papers. You have to find the minimum publishable unit, right, for your work, break it down into as many small papers as possible to inflate the numbers. Or there's castle building, and this one's interesting because it happens in different ways. For example, if you developed a piece of analytical code that analyzes a kind of data, what happens is that you want to keep it secret because it's part of your capabilities. And what happens a lot of the time is that you will trade this with other people where the condition is that if I help you do this, then I want to be the first or second author on a particular paper that comes out. So authorship on papers is traded as a condition for people to share their research in very limited ways rather than publicly. And these kind of pressures leads to a lot of questionable research practices. I was interviewing a quantitative social scientist, if you will. And they were telling me that in their field, they publish all of these papers, but if you ask them to share any of their methods, their data, their analytical code or anything with their protocols, they literally said it will be as if you're killing them. And the reason for that is because, and again, I'm quoting this person, because everyone manipulates their data. They remove the data they don't like. They would try different methods until they get one that looks the most pretty. They put it into the paper. And this is extremely prevalent in their field, that when they're a PhD student, they ask their supervisor or their colleagues, hey, shouldn't we publish this as well? And we should get reviewed, on this piece of analysis, or hey, there's a problem here. Shouldn't we report that in the paper? And then their colleagues or their supervisor would tell them, no, don't tell anyone about this. No one's going to find out anyway. And apparently this is, according to that person, this is how that field works. And this is related to another interesting point, is that because everything revolves around traditional peer-reviewed papers, it gives an oversized role to referees, right? Because, for any paper that's in the publication process, it might get maybe 2 peer reviewers, and that gives them a huge amount of power over the outcome of that paper, and sometimes indirectly the outcome of the author's careers. And not only is this a lot of power, but it is a lot of pressure on the peer reviewers, because it can be really stressful. I'm afraid of how the peer review that I'm writing might affect someone else's career. So it can be a scary thing for reviewers as well. And at the end of the day, according to them, it doesn't matter so much what you did, as long as you put your name on the paper, because once you got it, it's in the bank, right? And in order to put your name on papers, that's where connections and your prestige become more important than content. You don't need to do anything. You just need to know the right people. So a lot of politics of authorship come in. For example, there was a senior researcher that someone's supervisor wanted to shoehorn into a paper, and they want to have a reason for that. So the senior researcher gave this researcher a piece of sample on dry ice, and that was the justification for putting this really senior person on the paper. Or if you want to have a Nobel laureate, definitely put them at the top of the author list so that it will be noticed by the journal. So a lot of things like this happen, and I keep hearing them from these people I interviewed. And of course, there are a lot of plumbers who do invisible work, that people don't see. And I'm using plumbers because, again, this is a direct quote from the people I interviewed. It was a statistician, right? And they said, they were part of a research team that was preparing to publish a paper, and then they found a problem, in the statistical analysis. They provided a new view on it that completely changed the direction of the paper and which journal it went to. And this person, because they were only considered a plumber, they were put into the acknowledgement section of that paper instead. So they weren't even on the author list. And of course, other than this, there's so much work that goes into research, but only very few people are considered, enough to be authors. I was interviewing a social scientist who works with a lot of local communities around the world, and they heavily rely on local fixers, right, who have a lot of local tacit knowledge to introduce them, to people they want to interview, to establish trust and all of those things. But these people never end up, in a paper, right? So there's a lot of invisible work that happens here, and articulation work that's not recognized. And even if you put people on the paper, like the order of the authors on the paper says very little about exactly who did what and the level of those contributions. And this really is something that the people I interview struggle with. It's very difficult for people to decide how to do that. Now, I like this quote. Now, why are you asking the rocket scientists to figure out the Zoom meeting? Because I think that this was, told to me in the context of, this kind of messy division of labors that happens, or a lot of us, as we become more senior, we're expected to do a lot of things, but a lot of those work is not recognized. And of course, there are the clear and credit guidelines, for more equitable and more clear attribution for authors, but no one reads it. It has no impact. And all you need is a good story, because again, one person told me, I almost feel like I'm not a researcher anymore. I'm a novel writer. I have to make a very soundbitey point in order to get my paper published. I have to inflate how important it sounds in order to get a paper published or get my grant successfully funded. So what do we do about this? Well, they suggested actually voluntarily a lot of solutions, having more open critique to achieve better research, rather than just limiting it to a couple of rounds of peer review as you publish a paper. Maybe we can have a platform, for instance, where people just discuss research that's done and get recognition for that. Value division of labor, so that we actually give people who specialize in certain tasks along the research life cycle the recognition that they deserve, rather than as you become a more senior academic, you're expected to have to be really good at doing everything, which is stressful for everyone. I like this one, grants, assessing the grants. Some really senior people, they're asked to review grant applications and papers, but they haven't done the practical work in so long that they're actually barely qualified to assess the methods, right? Research is really interdisciplinary. There was another person I interviewed. They are a physicist who works in medicine now, and that became a big problem for them, because if they go to, I think it's the EPSRC, right, to apply for a more physicsy grant, they're like, oh, this is not within our remit because it's medicine. But then if they go to the MRC, they're like, oh, this is physics, and also go to the other people. And I really like this point in that they recognize there's no real scientific assessment of assessment itself. We haven't actually done a study on how well assessments are done, as if we're doing any other scientific research. So I think that's a really interesting point. Okay, so these are just some of the highlights from the interview I did, but what's the role of Octopus? Well, there's this pyramid that we really like from Brian Knows It from the Center for Open Science. Starts at the top, institutional stuff, setting policy for what's required. That creates incentives for rewarding people in research communities to enact certain cultural changes in behavior, right? But on the bottom of the pyramid are the experience of mechanically sharing more of your research and having the infrastructure to do so. And I think, this is where Octopus comes in, where it provides a necessary, albeit not sufficient, platform to help people share more of their research. So what's next? Okay, so we're at the last bit here. Going forward, some of our initial ideas are to follow people who are completely new to Octopus and evaluate how they respond to this and how this might fit into how they do research. Does that work? And maybe after a little while, after they've used it, we can evaluate their user experience after that and whether it continues to fit into the culture. But I would love to get your feedback as we are still developing how to actually do all of these things. I'm happy to hear what some of your thoughts are. Okay, so this is the bulk of what we've been doing for the last several months. But just really quick, I'd like to talk about this as a little piece of personal reflection. One reason I'm really interested in doing meta research and this kind of thing on how open research works is this, which helps me how to think about it, the difference between science and alchemy, right? And I learned this from Cory Doctorow, which is an author that you might have heard of. He said, alchemists kept what they knew a secret for 500 years, right? Because they didn't share what they've learned with each other. So they didn't advance the art very much. And every single one of them had to learn in the hardest possible way that drinking mercury was a bad idea. So I think this is a key distinction between alchemy and science, because science is an inherently iterative process where we are continually building on what came before. And I think as researchers, we have a responsibility to that iterative process to also make what we are doing available to other people as well. So to do good science is to do open science. However, like with all of the global challenges that we face today, we don't have time to be alchemists. We cannot afford to not change the way things work right now. Unfortunately, I have to say doing these interviews was kind of cathartic, but also depressing at the same time. Because none of what I've told you today are things that I have not heard before. None of this is news to me, but things have not changed. They said there's people now who want to change, but they're not in a position for that change to happen. By the time they are, everyone's giving up, everyone's leaving. Anyone with half a brain cell realizes that the academic system is not a level playing field, and they just get the hell out of Dodge as soon as possible. So coming back to this, pyramid, I think Octopus is really important. Before the changes that need to happen, we need other parts of the pyramid to change as well. And this is where systematic change comes in. And I think for people in positions of power, they have an even greater responsibility to enact this kind of systematic institutional change. Okay, so that's our presentation for you today. I know it's kind of long, but I would love to get your critique and feedback. Thank you.